Some of you, I hope, have picked up on my little play on words with the title of my program tonight. If not, you think that I'm just a really bad speller. But we're going to be talking about the Priddy families from mostly Henderson, Chester, and Madison County areas. As far as I've been able to find, and I've been researching this family most of my life, all of the Priddys in that three-county area descend from one man. His name was Thomas Priddy. He lived in Halifax County, Virginia. He is one of your DAR Revolutionary veterans, I believe, Gwen, that will have a flag put up that day. Now, I'm going to do this tonight kind of in two parts. The first part is the families leading up to Thomas Priddy. And even if you aren't part of that family, really what I want to center on with that part is some of the mistakes that we as genealogists make in our own family tree sometimes, and how we get off track by trusting information without following it. And then the second part will be about the Thomas Priddy family after leaving Virginia and coming to Tennessee. There's been a lot of work done on the Priddys over the years. There has even been a book written about the Priddy family. I don't think it's still in print. I do have a copy. There was at one time a Priddy family newsletter that went out regularly that lasted for several years. And along with that work, a lot of bad information has gotten put out there. Now, I hadn't figured out any way to do this without it getting really confusing. I've worked, and any way you go, when you're talking about a family tree, it gets confusing at some point. I wrote it and I get confused, believe me. But I don't want you to get too caught up in trying to follow exactly who all of the characters in this play are, because the point that I'm trying to make with this first part is not so much the family as how to go about researching on a family. The Priddy family almost surely comes from England, where there is actually a village called Priddy, England. They have a big folk festival fair every year, is what this sign is from. It's down in the area of Bristol in southwest England. Years and years ago, in the early internet days, when email was a new thing, some of you can remember, I was emailing with a man about the Priddy family. And I said, I understand there's a little village in England called Priddy. And he wrote back and said, I know, I live there. And I guess that's when I really realized that without return addresses on email, you don't know who you're talking to. The earliest that anybody's been able to find a Priddy in America was in the 1650s. A Captain Robert Priddy got several land grants in Virginia. Now, using that title of Captain Priddy, he has been christened as everything from a privateer who fought pirates on the high seas to being in charge of the British Navy the day they defeated the Spanish Armada. So far, I haven't found anything to even vaguely substantiate any of that. I don't know why he was a captain. There are a few other Priddys then mentioned over the next few generations who may or may not be his sons in Virginia. They were probably at least closely related, but we don't know exactly how. And so now we get to the generation that's born around 1700. This would be the one right before Thomas Priddy. And we want to figure out who Thomas Priddy's parents were. And this is where it starts getting tricky. There was a man named Robert Priddy who had lived in Hanover County, Virginia. That's up in the area of Richmond. And he moved his family then to Granville County, North Carolina. That's barely across the state line into North Carolina. And this Robert Priddy left a will in 1759. He was good enough to name all of his children in it for us. It is known that his wife's name was Susanna Harlow, and his children were Robert, Anne, George, who was probably the oldest because he inherited the plantation, William, Thomas, and a son named Harlow, his mother's maiden name. Some people have also assigned him a daughter named Frances, even though he doesn't mention a Frances in the will. This daughter, Frances, married a rich lawyer named Dudley Glass, and she will come into play very importantly in just a few minutes. So it kind of appears that this son Thomas is our Thomas Priddy. The family had come from Hanover County. We know that's where our Thomas Priddy came from. They had moved just over into North Carolina. Our Thomas Priddy lived just across the line in Virginia. And a lot of people then kind of took that ball and ran with it, including the man, literally, who wrote the book about the family. Well, one of the problems that I think we run into sometimes as genealogists is getting tunnel vision. And we look at what's there and draw conclusions from it without sometimes considering what's not there but should be. If somebody's missing from a record that we know ought to be included, there's probably a reason for that. Or maybe there's other names found that we can't make fit into it, so we just kind of discard them and pretend like they didn't happen because they don't fit. And that's what's happened here. And I think when that happens, we tend to want to prune them out of the family tree and pretend like they didn't happen because they don't fit our puzzle. What we need to do is look at whether we're even on the right track or not and determine, is this even the line that we need to go down? Now, I'm not going to try to give you all of the evidence that I have because first off, we don't have time, and secondly, it gets confusing, but I'm going to hit some high points. Robert Priddy of North Carolina named his children in his will. One of them was named Thomas. In Hanover County, where they had come from, there aren't many records left. They've all burned in courthouse fires, thanks to the Yankees. But there are a few records left in Hanover County, and some of those are processioning records. Now, processioning was a thing that they did in early Virginia, where every 4 years, men that were selected by the local parish leadership walked the property boundary of every piece of property in the parish to determine if the boundary lines were right. Think of it like you want to refinance your house. You know where your yard starts and your neighbor's yard stops, right? But you still have to have a survey done if you're going to have it refinanced. And so basically what they were doing was resurveying the property to make sure everybody was going by the right boundaries. And when we look at those processioning records, it pretty soon becomes apparent that we have two different Priddy families in play here. They may have been kin, but there are obviously two totally different families. There are clues like a Robert Priddy being mentioned as a landowner, when the one that had moved to North Carolina and his son Robert Jr. are both dead already. That's a pretty good clue right there. There is a man named Henry Priddy mentioned, who we don't have any inkling of him being related to the family in North Carolina. That's a second clue. But the real clincher is that our Thomas Priddy, our ancestor, who's the man at the center of this story, died in 1812 in Halifax County, Virginia. And there was another man named Thomas Priddy, still alive in Hanover County, who lived for at least 20 years after that. And by his will, it's clear that he didn't have any children because he left his estate to his girlfriend and his brothers and sisters. So then the question becomes then, which of these sets of parents that we have does our Thomas Priddy belong to? And when we start looking deeper and piecing these pieces of the puzzle together, we find a will for a man named Henry Burke in early Virginia, who left an inheritance to the children that my daughter Judith had by George Priddy. Now, there's no Judith associated with this North Carolina family, and it seems that Henry Priddy had inherited George Priddy's farm. Now, we saw in a different presentation a year or so ago that when land was inherited, there's no paperwork involved in it. You're not going to find deed records. It just suddenly belongs to the person that inherited it. So there's no paper trail to follow. Well, in the early 1770s, both George Priddy and Robert Priddy had owned land in Hanover County. And then all of a sudden in 1779, it says that they're both deceased and Henry Priddy owns that land now. So one of them is his daddy. We don't know for sure who the other one is. maybe an uncle, maybe a grandfather. And the one in North Carolina had at this point been dead for 20 years. And he didn't leave his farm to anybody named Henry. So we've got our two separate families. One's the Robert Priddy in North Carolina. His wife was Susanna Harlow. He named all of his children on the left side here. The other one on the right side married Judith Burke, because Henry Burke said, my daughter Judith had married George Priddy. And one or the other of them is probably the father of our Thomas Priddy, because they each had a son named Thomas. So let's look at the given names that they used, because people used family names. The one who had married Judith Burke passed down as given names in his family, Burke, Judith, and Thomas. And Burke and Judith are both names that are used in the Henderson County Priddy family for several generations. So that gives us a hint that we're probably on the right track there. But now comes the clincher. In 1791, in Halifax County, Virginia, Dudley Glass, the lawyer that had married Frances Priddy, is made the conservator of the estate of Robert Priddy, who was judged to be insane. And the court said that his estate is likely to be wasted if his brother-in-law, a lawyer, doesn't take it over, and it is currently in the hands of Thomas Priddy and others. So for the next 43 years, Robert Priddy's estate had regular reports made to the court by his caretakers, and from these we get a lot of family information. We find out that Thomas Priddy and Henry Priddy were his brothers, that Frances Glass was his sister. Every penny that Dudley Glass spent taking care of his brother-in-law Robert, he had to report to the county. We don't know what was wrong with him. We never will. We know that it wasn't a physical disability because he bought him saddles so he could ride. He had a penchant for collecting pocket knives. He bought one about every other month. He was able to have a charge account at some of the local grocery stores to where he could buy things, and then Dudley would go pay the bill at the end of the month. We know that he probably didn't drink, because usually in these accounts you find where they bought liquor at the store and charged it. That's never found in Robert Priddy's account of him buying liquor. More than once, Dudley Glass, if you can read this line right here, more than once he had to go bail slaves out of jail who had gotten arrested, who belonged to Robert. And on several occasions, he had to go collect money from Thomas and Henry Priddy that they had, or slaves that they had, that actually belonged to Robert. So he was taking care of him. In the long run, the joke was on them because Robert outlived every one of them. And all this was taking place in two counties, Halifax County, Virginia, where Thomas Priddy lived, and Hanover County, Virginia, where he had come from. And so what we find here is that George and Judith Priddy were the parents of Thomas Priddy, the Revolutionary War patriot, of poor insane Robert, and of all of those other brothers and sisters, and that Henry Burke was their grandfather. Now, Thomas Priddy had enlisted in the Virginia Volunteers in 1777. This is where the DAR comes in, and he became a corporal. One of his commanding officers was his brother-in-law, Dudley Glass. He worked his way up to captain. He may very well have been in charge of a company of men at the Battle of the Cowpens. And after the war, he married a neighbor, Mary Sneed. And in 1787, they sold their farm in Hanover County, Virginia, to a brother of his and moved down to Halifax County, close to the state line. Thomas Priddy ran a tavern in Halifax County in a little community that no longer exists called Meadsville. And the building itself actually stood into the 20th century. This is from one of the Halifax County histories of Thomas Priddy's Tavern, which was still standing in the early 20th century. Now, not very often do we get the chance in genealogy to know more about somebody than just their name and a few facts and dates. But in this case, we get a little glimpse of the Priddy family and also of what it was like to live in those times. Now, keep in mind, Halifax County was not some podunk Woods Place. It was on the main roads that were leading if you were going either west or south. In 1791, a U.S. congressman named William Lawton Smith was traveling through Virginia, and he kept a journal about his trip that's been published, and in it he wrote this: "At the moment that I crossed the ferry, I came on a thunderstorm. I, however, pushed on to Colonel Cole's. Here I tarried the forenoon, and after dinner proceeded on towards the Dan River to cross it at Dix's Ferry. The road was good for 10 miles. It's then very hilly. I put up this night at one Priddy's, a sorry tavern. I had for company an idiot, the landlord's brother, insane Robert, who was himself but one remove from being one, and I was waited on by an ugly, broken-backed old Negro woman. My fare was indifferent, as I was kept awake a great part of the night by bugs and fleas, and the groaning and grunting of the hogs under the window, and my man Ben being in the same chamber with me. All of this was enlivened by peals of thunder and the rattling of heavy rain on the shingles over my head, which continued nearly the whole night and began just as I entered the tavern. A mile or two from Priddy's, I came to the Bannister River, where I crossed over a bridge. And I seriously doubt if this is the same bridge, but it's the same location. Now, in defense of Thomas Priddy, the next night, Mr. Smith complained even worse about the tavern that he stayed at, too. So it seems like he was a little bit of a whiner from the get-go. But there was another traveler who wrote about being at Priddy's Tavern just 1 month later. Now, try to imagine that you are Thomas Priddy. This is something of what a tavern in these late 18th century would have looked like. And one morning, a coach, very possibly this exact one, pulls into the parking lot, and the President of the United States walks in and says, "I'd like to get some breakfast." George Washington wrote in his diary, Sunday, June 5th, left Old Town about 4 o'clock a.m. and breakfasting at one Priddy's after crossing the Bannister River a mile and a half. About 11 miles from it came to Stanton River, about 12, where meeting Colonel Cole, Isaac Coles, I went to his house and about 1 mile off to dine and halt a day for the refreshment of myself and horses, leaving my servants and them at one of the usually indifferent taverns at the ferry, that they might give no trouble or be inconvenient to a private family. So I guess our family can't say Washington slept here, but we did cook his breakfast. Our Thomas died in 1812. He did leave a will in which he names his wife and children. You'll see over on the right, I've circled to my son Bannister, and 2 of the sons down here, one is named Burke, named after his granddaddy. But here's the main point I want to make from this first part. Because not everybody does the research themselves, and they just find something that looks like it fits and cut and paste it onto their own family tree. There are currently 17 family trees on Ancestry.com that show Thomas Priddy's parents as being George and Judith Burke. There are 2,480 that say that his parents were Robert Priddy and Susanna Harlow, which is incorrect. So don't be too quick to just copy everything you see on other people's genealogy family trees, because that snowball rolls. And when you look at, well, there's 2,500 that say it must be true. It's not. Now, Thomas and Mary had 10 or 11 children, but we're going to focus on just 3 of them, the 3 that are up here in red. The others scattered out over 5 or 6 states. Bannister was born in 1790. He was a toddler when George Washington ate breakfast in his daddy's tavern. He may have sat on the president's lap while he ate his breakfast, for all we know. And it's probably not a coincidence that the family lived right along the Bannister River. But whether Bannister Priddy is named for the river or the river was named for somebody earlier in his family is open to debate. Probably he was named for the river. Bannister served 2 short stints in the War of 1812, and then he married Sarah Phelps, a neighbor, in 1815. 9 years later, they sold their farm in Virginia and moved to Henderson County, Tennessee. Now, they pretty much cleaned out Halifax County when they did it, because we know that coming with them were Sarah's parents, her 6 adult brothers and their families, an uncle of hers named McCraw, one of Bannister's sisters and her family, and several other families from Halifax County. All came probably at the same time to Henderson County. A few years later, another Priddy brother would join them there. And a history of Chester County says that the Phelps families were the first settlers at what is now Mifflin, Tennessee. And the very old Phelps Cemetery is in that area in Mifflin. Now I'm going to mention the last brother to come here first because his line fades out pretty quickly, or so I thought until just a few minutes ago. Of John Priddy's 9 sons, 5 of them are said to have been Confederate soldiers. 3 were killed, 1 was a prisoner of war. Their sister, according to family legend, flew a Confederate flag at her house until the day she died in 1927. The funny thing is, she lived in California at the time. But the main thing that John Priddy did for us was that he filed for a pension from the War of 1812. And in that pension, he gives us virtually his life story. Their sister, Catherine Keturah, married David Bird back in Virginia. And this made her Kitty Priddy Bird. You know her kids never said anything about that. Her family lived out in the Shady Hill community. That's a little bit south of Darden, over on the east side of Henderson County. The biography that I have of them was written by Kathy Haney Williams. She had 4 sons and 2 grandsons in the Confederate Army, and only 1 of the 6 came home. The surviving son was Thomas Priddy Bird. Can you imagine what it was like for his wife Elizabeth to see her 46-year-old husband and her 2 oldest sons all go off and leave for the war and leave her at home with 5 kids who weren't yet grown up? And he also had a brother and a son named Bannister Priddy Bird. And Kathy's husband, Butch, is, I believe, a 3rd great-grandson of Kitty Priddy Bird. Sorry, I can't stop saying that. So now that gets us to Bannister Priddy, the original immigrant who is mostly responsible for the name in West Tennessee. And I'm sorry I don't trace out the daughters any better, but there's 2 reasons. One is that I haven't been able to trace all of them, and 2 is that they no longer, of course, once they married, carried the name Priddy. Bannister and Sarah and their 9 children lived out in the Middle Fork, Huron, Mifflin area of Henderson County. Chester County had not been formed yet at that time. And it might be a good thing that they didn't live any closer than they did to his sister on the other side of the county. I'll explain why in a little bit. In 1850, he and Sarah owned 9 slaves, but this was 3 women and 6 very small children. So most of the work on the farm was being done by Bannister and his 6 sons. He died in 1858, and he's buried in his family cemetery. Sarah lived 6 more years and is buried next to him. Now, their 6 sons blessed us in generation 3 with 20 grandsons in Henderson County named Priddy. Thank goodness, 7 of them moved to Texas and 1 went to Missouri, or else we would be absolutely overrun with Priddy people around here. In the book about the family, Mr. Butler says that he thinks there are probably more Priddys in Texas than anywhere else, and there is even a town of Priddy, Texas, that's named after one of the family that came from Virginia. And if you can see the sign over the Priddy store, they advertise gas, diesel, groceries, hardware, wine, ice, and deli. Who needs a Walmart? Man, Priddy store has got it going. And I think that's the only store in town, by the way. It's between Dallas and Austin. Only 5 of those 20 grandsons from that generation 3 left any sons who stayed in this area. And that's the 5 that are in red type here: Tom, Gramp, William Gaines, James T., and George W. Now, of these 6 brothers that were in generation 2, Granville went to Mississippi. He lived there for about 30 years, fought in the Confederate Army, and then came back home, where he is buried at Chapel Hill Baptist Church. We'll get to his sons, Tom and Gramp, here in just a minute. Burke Amon Priddy was a very prominent man in the Lexington-Henderson County area, but he had daughters and no sons that stayed in this area. So his Priddy family dies out. He's buried in the Priddy family cemetery near his parents. James T., or James M., married Melinda Knowles. Her daddy was the richest man in Henderson County. He gave the land that Chapel Hill Baptist Church and Chapel Hill Cemetery are on today. And of their 7 children, only 3 are thought to have lived to adulthood. Now, if there was a rogue in the family, and I said if, because some of you are descended from him, it might have been James. During Reconstruction, he was appointed the Henderson County Clerk by Governor Parson Brownlow. If you know your Tennessee history, Parson Brownlow was the Reconstruction governor in Tennessee who openly advocated for hanging all former Confederate sympathizers. So the fact that James was appointed to a county office tells us something about his politics. And for a time, county court was held in James's store after the courthouse had burned down during the war. Well, James did run into a little bit of trouble when it seems that the county clerk's office was holding a $10,000 inheritance for one of the local families. And while he was a little short on personal funds, James decided that he would have plenty of time to borrow from the inheritance and return it before anybody knew about it. He was wrong. And so his store was shut down and was going to be auctioned off to help repay part of his debt. But after it had been shut down and locked up, when they went back to inventory the sales stock for auction, it seems a lot of the stock had disappeared in the meantime. And also in the meantime, James had been allowed to go out towards Huron and buy a farm, even though he was broke. Well, they were going to sell his livestock to get some of the money back, but the livestock disappeared. Seems that the deputy sheriff who delivered the warrant to him was his little brother George. And they did find some of the livestock later. It had wandered over to the farm next door, which belonged to his little brother George. And this case wound up in the Tennessee Supreme Court, and the file is over 300 pages thick. Now, the 4th son was George H. Priddy. He had 4 sons: James, Edmund, George W., and Bannister. Of these, only James and George W. had sons, and I'm going to come back to George in a little bit. The 2 youngest sons then of Bannister and Sarah's were Thomas and William Priddy. They did not either one have any sons who remained in this area. All of their sons either died young or went to Texas. And you can kind of see from this just what going to Texas meant in those days. Here's 7 out of 20 in this family that all moved to Texas. So only Tom, Gramp, William Gaines, James T., and George W. out of this 3rd generation have left us any Priddys in this West Tennessee area. But just like generation 2, who had 21 sons but left 5 sons in West Tennessee, those 5 had 20 sons between them, but not that many, again, to pass the name on. There was Tom. He lived in Chester County when it was formed. His sons, James Rufus, Elpert, and Luther, all lived in and around Lexington. Then there was Granville Jr. Apparently everybody called him Gramp. That's the only name that I find listed for him in the newspapers, is Gramp. Gramp did help keep the Priddy name going with 6 sons of his own: James Henry, Bose, Zolly, Burke, Samuel, and Harvey. Samuel is your granddaddy, right, Jerry? And tell me your dad's name. Samuel is your daddy. Was your daddy. Burke Priddy's sons, some of you may have known Robert and Red Priddy that worked here for years at the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. Sherry Priddy, that's a good friend of mine, is a retired banker here in town. Burke was her granddaddy. William Gaines Priddy had 5 sons. Again, only 2 of those had sons of their own. Bud Priddy has a grandson named Danny Priddy that lives in Lexington, is a genealogist and works on the Priddy family tree. William Gaines also had William Grant Priddy, who is Ginger Bankston and Jan Page's granddaddy. James's only son went to California. I corresponded with him years ago about the part of the family after they went to California. George W. had 5 sons, O.H., Bert, Foster, Roy, and Clifford, but out of those, the only one that still has descendants in this area, as far as I know, was O.H. Priddy. He actually went by Ollie Priddy. You may know Jimmy Priddy and Paul Priddy that live here in Jackson. O.H. Priddy was their granddaddy. Ross Priddy, that's on the city council, is his great-grandson. Now, I skipped over George H. Priddy because this is my family, and they're the ones I know the most about. George H. married Eliza Knowles. His brother James had married Eliza's sister, so their kids were double cousins. I bet that throws a kink in the DNA testing. George H. was the deputy sheriff who delivered the warrant to his brother. He and James both supported the Union very strongly during the Civil War, which is why I said it's probably good that they didn't live closer to their sister, since she lost most of her family in the Confederate Army. Their sons were a little too young to fight in the war. They were probably just a little too old. But 2 men who later became George's sons-in-law were both Confederate soldiers. I can't help but wonder how those conversations went. George H. and his brother both lived in the Chapel Hill community out in the Huron-Luray area on adjoining farms. He and Eliza had 10 children, and one of them, the second one from the bottom, Sarah Sophronia Wayne, is my great-grandmother. Now, in 1866, George became a deputy sheriff under Governor Parson Brownlow's administration, so again, it's clear where his politics were. And both James and their father-in-law, Edmund Knowles, filed claims for expenses that they had gotten during the war, and they both swore that they were always allegiant to the Union. And from all evidence, they were. George H. lived until 1891. He and Eliza are buried at Chapel Hill Cemetery, there by Chapel Hill Baptist Church. The Knowles are buried very close to them. My great-grandparents are buried right over by that back driveway circle behind them. According to Find a Grave, there are 11 people named Priddy buried at Chapel Hill, and that doesn't include ones like my great-grandmother and her 2 sisters, who were no longer named Priddy, of course, at the time. Now, overall, the Priddy families seem to have been very highly thought of over the generations. James founded the county poorhouse in Henderson County. Several of them held county offices. Several of them were Masons. They were leaders in the Missionary Baptist Church. They were very respected in their community. They're spoken highly of in the local papers. But of course, all families have a few who slip up just a time or 2 in life. And as genealogists, we really like dragging out the skeletons from the closet. And there were just a few in the Priddy family, like Bose Priddy, who in 1889 got a little carried away at the Saturday night dance and pulled out his pistol and started shooting. Now, to Bose's credit, he was a good shot because he fired 5 times and every one of them hit somebody. But the Hodgin boys did both recover and lived several more years. It said in the paper at the time one of them was not expected to, but he did. Then there was Alonzo Priddy. In 1906, Alonzo, and Ginger, this is your granddaddy's big brother, Alonzo had moved to Memphis and married when he was shot and killed by his brother-in-law. Well, the problem came in at the funeral when Alonzo's widow and his mother got in a fight over whether they were going to bury him in Memphis or Lexington. His mother tried to get the police to step in, and they said, "No, lady, we're not touching this with a 10-foot pole." The widow did win. He's buried in Memphis. And then there was James again. He got in a fight with his brother-in-law too. Must have been something, at least they kept it in the family. He got into a fight with his brother-in-law, James Knowles, and it says that Priddy hit him on the head with a slingshot, knocked him down and fractured his skull, from which he would probably die. James Knowles did not die either. Obviously, the papers in that time were not real optimistic about these things. And then there was George W. Priddy. They weren't the luckiest ones either. George W. Priddy had tried for years to become the postmaster at a little community called Foster out in the Life area. And Burke Priddy was the one that told me this story years ago before I found it. He became the postmaster, and 2 days later when the train came through, he stepped on to take the mail sack and fell off the train and fell under the wheels and lost a leg. Again, the paper said he may not recover. George Priddy did die 41 years later. And we have to kind of wonder about George, because it says here that even as well as he was thought of, the preacher had named him Sister Priddy's husband. Now, you know, you can read into that what you want, but when instead of it being Mr. and Miss Priddy, it was Sister Priddy and her husband, somehow I just think the preacher was kind of jabbing him a little bit. Every once in a blue moon, as genealogists, we have one of those days when, man, you hit the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Gwen, you talked about one just a couple of weeks ago with finding some records. Well, several years ago, I had gone to Paducah to visit a lady who was my mom's first cousin. My granddaddy and her mother were brother and sister. And I saw this little picture sitting on a shelf. And I asked her who it was, and she said, I have no idea. She said, I just know that it was my grandmother Wayne's, and she cherished it dearly. Well, she let me bring it home, which was the first thing I couldn't believe. And when I took it out of the frame, I found that the frame was manufactured in the 1870s. It's an embryo type picture. The lady in the picture is wearing an 1870s time period dress, and written in the back of it says G.H. Priddy, Lexington, Tennessee. Well, by putting all of those together, I believe that it's Eliza Knowles Priddy. And the reason my great-grandmother cherished it was because it's her own mother who died when Sarah was only 18 years old, and it's the only picture that she had of her. I have since found a picture of her husband, also George H. Priddy, and this is the couple that are buried at Chapel Hill Baptist Church. Well, on that same trip, I met another cousin, and I asked him if he had ever known anything about a Priddy family Bible, and he said, no, I've never heard anybody mention a family Bible. Well, a couple of weeks later, he called me and said, you know, after you were here, my son came down from Louisville to visit, and I mentioned about meeting you and about you asking about a family Bible, and he said, Daddy, don't you remember when Grandmama died? She had that Bible, and you let me take it home. It's at my house in Louisville. So I got to go back to Paducah and take photographs of the George H. Priddy family Bible, which goes back to 1825, and it has the birth dates and marriage dates of my great-great-grandparents and all of their children leading up into, I guess the last one written in there is in the 1940s. In 1932, the George Priddy family had a big family reunion at Luray. Over 130 people were there. Probably families of some of y'all were there. It was the 5 surviving children of George and Eliza Priddy were all there together and posed together. My great-grandmother, Ms. Wayne, is the second one from the right. These 5 brothers and sisters, according to the article in the Memphis Commercial Appeal at the time, totaled over 370 years between them, and 2 of the sisters had not seen each other in 43 years. Now, there was a clipping about it in the Memphis Commercial Appeal. I'm not sure, but in reading the clipping, it says after dinner was served, the crowd was entertained for a while by the acting of little Betty June Wayne, the attractive and talented daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Wayne of Jackson. I have an idea that my grandmother, Mrs. John Wayne, probably wrote that article, and that she made sure she got in there a brag on my mama being a 6-year-old. I'm sure all of those people at their family reunion were thrilled to see my 6-year-old mother dancing around, acting and performing for them. I've also since found another picture. This is one of the sisters that was already dead by the reunion. Her name was Amanda Gillum. Some of you, there are a lot of Gillum and Stedman families in Jackson that descend from them. Some of you may know Carol Moss, or my friend Lindsay Wilhite, Carol's daughter, are both directly descended from this family. And finally, the Bannister Priddy Cemetery, which we were talking about just a few minutes ago. These are the oldest graves in the family that I'm aware of. Now, I'm not going to say exactly where this cemetery is, since it's on privately owned by an out-of-state corporation posted land. And I may or may not have been to it at one time. And I was with you. It was read by the WPA in the 1930s, and when we did or did not visit it just a few years ago, nearly all of the stones could still be found and read. The readable dates on it range from 1850s up into the 1890s. And there's something really neat that I want to kind of leave you with. This is Bannister and Sarah, the original immigrant couple. They are buried side by side. And then there are a number of sons, daughters, grandchildren buried there. But there are also buried in the cemetery, and this is one of them, several black families. Now these are named, this one in particular is named Phelps. You remember the Phelps were Sarah Priddy's family that came with them. And we know that the families stayed in touch even after slavery, because there are numerous times when Priddy's would have a black servant named Phelps living with them, and vice versa in the years after slavery. And most of us have probably seen family cemeteries with a slave section. These families are buried there up into the 1890s, 25 or 30 years after slavery ended. And the only conclusion that I can draw from that is that the black members of the family, or however you want to word it, aren't buried there because somebody told them they had to be, but because they wanted to be. And that all of these families, the Priddys and the Phelps and the McAdams and the Rhodes, and I can't remember, Wallace's I know is one of the very prominent names, stayed close enough that they wanted to be buried together there in that Bannister Priddy Cemetery up in the woods out towards Luray. According to Find a Grave, there are 123 Priddys buried in either Henderson, Chester, or Madison County. And of course, that's only the ones whose name remained Priddy. And so you get a family tree that kind of looks like this, with all of its twists and turns. And these Priddy folks are now on, by my count, I think Hardin is a 9th generation member of this family in West Tennessee. And they seem to be going strong. In fact, some of us just get prettier by the day. Any questions that I might be able to answer?